Welcome to Tell Me More. I want to try to do two things in the time we have. One is to, and first, have you share what you thought of the sermon, or just what you think of this parable yourself, because it's what I call a master parable, meaning that it has many layers of meaning, and the more you read it, the more you pick up on something you hadn't seen before. So it's a wonderful Lucan parable. There's another one in Luke that you'll all be familiar with as well. That's the parable of the Prodigal Son. Another master parable. And then the second thing I want to do, I'm going to push a book this morning and hope that you'll buy it. And I'm going to read some quotes from it, and maybe that will encourage you to buy it. It's just excellent. It's short stories by Jesus, and the author is Amy Jill Levine. She's Jewish as a person, but she's a professor of New Testament and Jewish studies, and professor of New Testament and Jewish studies at Vanderbilt Divinity School in Nashville. She's a well-known author, but this little book called Short Stories by Jesus, all of these short stories are parables. And a subtitle is The Enigmatic Parables of a Controversial Rabbi. Very well put, don't you think? So I'm just going to read some quotes out of here, because I really hope you'll either buy the book, or I don't know whether it's in the Sarasota and Manatee County library system or not, but it may well be, since it's a recently published book. She writes in her introduction, parables, stories some only a sentence or two long, are often seen as the hallmark of Jesus' teaching. As Mark 4:33-34 puts it, quote, she's quoting the Gospel of Mark, with many such parables he spoke the word to them as they were able to hear it. He did not speak to them except in parables, but he explained everything in private to his disciples, unquote. And then she writes, few of these private explanations have been preserved. The crowds then needed to find their own understandings, and we too must find ours. It's a very good thing that the interpretations, if indeed Jesus did provide them, have not come down to us. The gospel writers, in their wisdom, left most of the parables as open narratives in order to invite us into engagement with the parables. Each reader will hear a distinct message and may find that the same parable leaves multiple impressions over time. You may have a different interpretation each time you read it. Different audiences inevitably hear different messages, just as today a listener who is poor or in ill health may form a different interpretation of the rich man and Lazarus than a person with a seat on the stock exchange or extended credit from Neiman Marcus. Reducing parables to a single meaning destroys their aesthetic as well as their ethical potential. This surplus of meaning is how poetry and storytelling work, and it is all to the good. And then in regard to our parable today, the Good Samaritan, I have a real funny quote that she wrote about. I can find it here, I think. Well, the parable of the Good Samaritan is so well known for its message of aiding a stranger that has become a staple of political discourse. Former U.S. President George W. Bush invoked the parable in his first inaugural address, and then she quotes him, I can pledge our nation to a goal. When we see that wounded traveler on the road to Jericho, we will not pass to the other side. Bush's presumption was that the U.S. population, who in the minds of some of our politicians are all Christians, would immediately pick up the reference, wounded traveler and road to Jericho, both images from the parable. And then she writes, I checked with a Jewish friend of mine a naturalized U.S. citizen who pays more attention to national and local politics than most people I know. She thought the reference might have been to an accident in New York, since she knew there was a Jericho on Long Island. When I noted that the reference was biblical, she then wondered if the president was thinking of Rahab, the prostitute from Jericho, who aided the spies sent into the land by Joshua. So, outside of what the Bible says in the parable in Luke's Gospel, people will pick up on the Good Samaritan outside of the Bible. In other words, they'll pick up whatever they hear. I know when I was still living in Rochester, New York, one of the radio stations sponsored a Good Samaritan vehicle, which drove the interstates around Rochester, and they also go through Rochester to find people who needed help. And so it became the Good Samaritan wagon or something along that line. Let me give you another couple quotes. Wanting to justify himself. Remember that phrase? That is, wanting to make himself look right in the eyes of anyone listening in. The lawyer asks another question. His concern for self-justification is something, this is maybe unique to Luke. I'm not sure the other three gospel writers have the same take. His concern for self-justification is something Luke's Jesus despises. Later in the gospel, Jesus condemns the Pharisees, whom Luke portrays, contrary to all other sources, as lovers of money, with the accusation, "You are those who justify yourselves in the sight of others, but God knows your hearts, for what is prized by human beings is an abomination in the sight of God." His question, "Who is my neighbor?" is on the technical level not a bad one. The Hebrew term usually translated neighbor, the term that appears in Leviticus, has several, an Old Testament book has several connotations. In Genesis, it means fellow or other guy. And the New Revised Standard Version translation of the Bible renders this verse with concerns the building of the Tower of Babel. And they said to one another rather than literally, and said a man to his neighbor. Exodus uses neighbor to describe an intimate friendship between God and Moses. And again, the New Revised Standard Version misses the technical term by translating, "The Lord used to speak to Moses face to face as one speaks to a friend." The term translated friend is actually neighbor. So this brings up an interesting question, which I'm sure at least some of you are aware of, that many Jewish words have various meanings. And I think the reason for that is that they didn't have as many verb tenses in biblical Hebrew. And they couldn't say technically or narrowly some things that we can say. So if you think about it, that opens up for interpretation. Which meaning under this one word do you pick? Now, Luke is known for his high Greek writing. He was highly educated, in other words. It wasn't street Greek necessarily. As the parable turns to the Good Samaritan, and that's the part where in the parable it says a Samaritan traveling came near and seeing had compassion and so forth. As the parable turns to the Good Samaritan, the parable's structure changes. As spare as the earlier descriptions of priest and Levite were, the text now lavishes attention on the Samaritan's actions. The robbers steal and wound while the Samaritan tends with his own goods. The bandits leave the man half dead while the Samaritan returns him to life. Whereas the priest and Levite go out of their way to distance themselves from the victim, the Samaritan literally goes up to him and shows him compassion. Luke had already used the term, which carries the connotation of a visceral reaction, that is, he felt it in his guts, to describe Jesus' response to seeing the widow of Nain at her son's funeral and some other things. The Samaritan's compassion then becomes, for many of today's interpreters, the hook by which the sermon functions. In a number of settings, the parable serves as a warning against prejudice. For example, the two who walk by are a pastor and a choir director, while the Samaritan is a gay man, an illegal immigrant, a person on parole, or any other victim of bigotry. The point in this reading is that they are really nice, and we sometimes fail in our obligations to help, and that we too should have compassion. And she mentions we have so-called Good Samaritan laws designed to protect people who aid accident victims. I suppose Florida has those, don't they? Yeah. Had the parable been said in New York rather than Judea, our lawyer likely would volunteer to represent the man in the ditch, sue the Samaritan for improper medical treatment, and take 30 pieces of silver for the settlement. Apparently she has not the highest regard for lawyers as well, but to understand the parable as did its original audience, those who heard it first, we need to think of Samaritans less as oppressed but benevolent figures, and more as the enemy, as those who do the oppressing. From the perspective of a man in the ditch, Jewish listeners might balk at the idea of receiving Samaritan aid. They might have thought, I'd rather die than acknowledge that one from the group that saved me. I do not want to acknowledge, for example, that a rapist has a human face. I do not want to recognize that a murderer will be the one to rescue me. It says, this is from the parable, and upon the next day taking out, he gave 2 denarii to the innkeeper and said, take care of him, and whatever you might spend, I upon my return will give back to you. In 1980, British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher claimed, quote, nobody would remember the Good Samaritan if he had only good intentions. He had money as well. Unquote. Mrs. Thatcher overstates the parable would still convey its basic message had it stopped at the previous verse. Thus her comment at best serves to prompt another question. What does Luke 10:35 contribute to the parable? That is, taking care of him. First, the verse makes clear that the Samaritan is not a social victim. He has money, freedom to travel, the ability to find lodging, more than what Jesus found in the Samaritan village, that's 2 weeks ago, and some leverage with the innkeeper. The parable in its original setting is not about the type of prejudice that creates people on the margins. It's about hatred between groups who have similar resources. Second, a benevolent reading of the Samaritan's actions understands him as providing not one-time aid, but long-term care. Excuse me. Thus, the sense of loving neighbor means continual action, not something to check off on your to-do list. The Samaritan's offering the innkeeper what amounts to a blank check fits within Jesus' overall concern for generosity. Moreover, his trusting the innkeeper to care for the wounded man echoes the trust the wounded man had to have had in him. By trusting the innkeeper, he provides confirmatory evidence that we make our neighbors, that trust is essential for life. Isn't that true? Yeah. More cynical interpreters, aware of how Jesus' Jewish audience likely felt about this Samaritan hero, might see an ominous implication in the Samaritan's final actions. The Samaritan promises to return, and should he be displeased with the innkeeper's ministrations, he will repay in kind. The Samaritan made the choice to care for the man in the ditch. The innkeeper's motives to continue the care, benevolence, financial incentive, fear of retaliation, go unspoken. In the long run, at least as far as the victim is concerned, they may not matter. Of ultimate import is not our motive, but our action. The parable proper ends here, but as you heard in the parable and in the sermon, Jesus is not done with the lawyer yet. And neither are we, she writes.